after David Cameron rejects a deal on Europe? Is Britain in danger of becoming irrelevant, isolated and marginalised on the world stage? Well, those were the words not of the Prime Minister's political opponents, but of his deputy, Nick Clegg. Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. Today we're in Greenwich, where in the past Britain's Navy ran its empire. In today's show, as cracks appear in Britain's ruling coalition, is David Cameron suffering delusions of grandeur in believing that Britain can stand alone on the world stage? Well, before we find out what the public thinks, here's a short video clip.
David Cameron's refusal to support a treaty creating a fiscal union between Eurozone members caused dismay amongst his coalition partners, the Liberal Democrats. They complained that Mr. Cameron made the decision without properly consulting them. Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg said that the UK would lose its foothold in the world and become isolated and marginalised. He went on, a Britain which leaves the EU will be considered to be irrelevant by Washington and will be a pygmy in the world. The view in Europe after the summit was that Chancellor Merkel had risen in stature, while David Cameron had turned into a dead end. Merkel was presented in the media as a global leader alongside US President Barack Obama and Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao, with David Cameron bickering from the sidelines. During the Suez Crisis in 1956, the US threatened to withhold financing unless Britain withdrew from the Suez Canal. Harold Macmillan, who would soon become Prime Minister, said the nation was experiencing the last grasp of a declining power. David Cameron still maintains that Britain can be a global military power, despite the defence cuts. But many world leaders disagree. Referring to Britain's claims over the Falkland Islands, the Argentine President Cristina Kirchner accused David Cameron of arrogance and said, in the 21st century, Britain continues to be a crude colonial power in decline. So where is David Cameron leading Britain? And what would be the impact if the country were to become politically isolated from its strategic partners in Europe and the US?
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. I began today by asking people what they knew about David Cameron's decision to veto the European Union treaty and why Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg said that very veto would isolate the United Kingdom.
I don't know too much at all, really. I'm glad he has, if that's of any use, but that's all I can tell on it, really.
I'm aware of it. I know what it stands for and everything. It wasn't actually a treaty that was being vetoed. It was a proposal for a revised treaty which would have various terms that would actually have governed the financial arrangements of the individual countries, but the detail wasn't explicit, so it wasn't actually a treaty. It was moving towards the treaty that was actually vetoed.
What do you know about the results of David Cameron's decision to veto the European Union treaty?
All I know is that he came back. It's quite popular what he did. I think there's a lot of opposition to the way the EU's run. I think the EU is an institution. The idea is good, but I think the way it's run it has a lot to be desired. Leaves a lot to be desired.
Well, I know that he did veto it, and he was the odd one out of 17.
Well, I know he vetoed one in 27, so he's a single man now. And, well, this is not good for the future of Britain, I think.
Why do you think Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg said that veto will actually isolate Britain?
Well, I think it's that we perhaps are no longer seen to be making the same decisions as the other big powers like the French and the Germans. And I think that he possibly sees that the Conservative policy has been anti-Europe from the beginning, whereas the Liberal Democrats are much more pro the EU.
This has been tried before in the 19th century, and then they had the gold standard and it all fell apart. And I think the Lib Dems are committing political suicide.
Well, why did he agree with it before? And when they came back, what's the other chap's name? The business secretary. He said Cameron couldn't do anything else. So I'm not very keen on Nick Clegg.
Why do you think, though, that Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg said that Britain would be isolated as a result of the veto.
Because the Lib Dems have always been basically very, totally pro-Euro.
I'm sure that's true. I mean, it's just the wrong stage at which to throw a wobbly. I mean, when we're talking about the detail would be in the time to discuss particular issues.
Potentially. I think as an alien to England, I've always seen England as being fairly isolated anyway, both sort of like philosophically and culturally.
Well, those were the views of the public here on the streets of London. Let's now find out what our experts have to say.
There was a proposal to move towards having an intergovernmental conference, and David Cameron said that, OK, I will support you in these moves to have an intergovernmental conference, at which point there would be discussions about the treaty, about having a possible treaty. At that point there was no treaty, there wasn't even a draft treaty, there was just an idea to have a treaty which would then, if ratified, and which is a whole process which would take many years, then of course the EU would have more control over the budgets of member states. It has some control, but this would be a great deal of control. David Cameron said, I'll support you in this as long as part of the treaty discussions would be about moving the area of financial service regulation from being one where there's qualified majority voting, and Britain could in theory be outvoted in the Council of Ministers when there's EU lawmaking taking place, restoring the national veto, so that if there's a proposal from the European Commission which has the sole right to legislate, to propose legislation within the European Union, if there's something which the British government were to think is not in this country's interest, they'd be able to stop it. If it's under what's known as qualified majority voting, Britain could be outvoted, and we could have measures that would damage the City of London, damage British banking, foisted upon the UK, which would cost the economy billions. So really that was what happened, but it was rejected. One of the main motivators of Nick Clegg is that he's very pro-EU. He supports more powers being handed to the European Union. He's supported Britain joining the Euro, which would of course have been a mistake. And of course he started his career working for the European Commission. So really he has somewhat of an interest there, because this was his grounding in politics and in public life, because he was an employee of the European Union before becoming an MEP and then before becoming an MP. So that's I think a lot of the background of Nick Clegg. But it won't isolate Britain. Britain is one of the largest contributors to the EU. The British taxpayer hands over billions of pounds to the European Union each year. We believe at the Bruges Group that this is money that the UK can't actually afford, but we're still in that position. So Britain won't be isolated, but unfortunately Britain is still a member of the European Union and still has the costs of the EU, not just the costs of the billions of pounds that the British taxpayer has to hand over, but also the excessive burden of EU regulation, which damages British business and undermines the UK's economy and the ability of the UK to compete in the global marketplace.
We can say that Cameron's decision was not a surprise, first of all. From Cameron's perspective, Britain is not a member of the Eurozone, and as such, Britain is not directly threatened from the Eurozone crisis. However, Britain might not be threatened directly, but is influenced by what is going on in Europe, and most importantly is influenced by the decisions that are taken in Europe, by the Eurozone states, but also by all 27, the other 26 member states. Contrary now to the perspective of France and Germany, who actually went to the summit in order to find a solution to the Eurozone, to the Euro crisis, Cameron's perspective was totally different. He knew what he wanted, and he went there in order to safeguard the interests of Britain, and most importantly the interest of the City of London, to safeguard the city's future prospects as a global financial market. On the other hand, Cameron had to face the Europhiles, and most importantly the Lib Dems, his coalition partners. In fact, some Lib Dems went even to the extreme, and accused Cameron of betraying Britain. Nick Clegg's initial stance was complacent. He said that he regretted the decision, but given the circumstances, there was nothing else that Cameron could do. That was his first reaction, of course. So within this context, this decision is not a surprise. We all knew what was going to happen to the summit. Yeah.
Itself on being a key player in international affairs, but is its willingness to turn its back on Europe a sign that Britain is a nation in retreat? Well, Nick Clegg says that if Britain were to isolate itself from Europe, it would become a pygmy in the world, and in doing so damage the lives of millions of people in this country. Well, let's find out if the public agrees with him.
Not anymore, because in the Eurozone and in Europe, everything's collapsing because we're not open to the world. I mean, I said we shrink. The market's shrunk by 10-15% in the past 30 years, and the world trade is growing.
If the Eurozone crashes, then that's definitely bad for us, obviously, because we're so, such a large proportion of our trade is with the Eurozone. But I don't think intrinsically of itself it has to be bad.
Mr. Clegg said that the veto would be bad for jobs, bad for growth, and would damage the livelihoods of millions of people. Don't you think he had a point?
No. No, because effectively, because of world trade, we are involved also with other countries, and China's coming up, Singapore is coming up. But we have many links with other countries. We've always been a trading nation. We should trade as much with other people as the East. The whole point of the EEC, I put it this way, it should be a free trade area.
No. I mean, it's bad enough for jobs now whilst we're in it. It can't get much worse, I wouldn't think.
Really don't know. I mean, no one seems to be able to call these things accurately, so it's a question of where your emotional sympathies are.
What do you think about what Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg said, that the veto will cost lots of jobs, it will damage the economy and will affect the livelihoods of millions of people?
Well, to be honest, I think he's right in what he says there. It will do a lot of damage. It will do a lot of damage. And to be honest, it might be unrepairable damage.
They still need our trade. We export a lot to the rest of Europe, so where are they going to go?
Britain has had a long history of influencing events in the world. It's been a big player on the global stage. Do you think that now there's a danger that it will be on the sidelines, certainly in terms of Europe, and not have any influence?
No, not really. I mean, I think we're quite a major player in Europe, whether we're in the EU or not. I mean, I think the EU's got good because it gives us access to the markets over there, but I think we could negotiate a bit better and be a bit more of a major player in it. Because at the moment, I think we are a bit reactive when we could actually be trying to influence things a bit more.
No, we're supposed to be Great Britain, and that's what we are. I can't. Why should we? We'd got along very well before. Better, in fact.
There's got to be a danger that that's possible. I think, but again, I don't think it needs to happen, because although 40% of our trade is outbound to the Eurozone, a large proportion of their trade is in our direction as well.
Britain has a long history of being a major player on the world stage and influencing events globally. Do you think there's a danger now that Britain could be sidelined and not have that voice?
Well, I think we're still members of a lot of other international organisations, so I don't think that's necessarily going to be true. But obviously our economy is shrinking and contracting, so perhaps there is an element of that economically if we have a marginal role in the EU.
Well, I'm quite looking forward to taking a back seat role for a change, instead of always trying to fight above our weight.
Obviously it's going to mean that we're actually essentially excluded from decision making, and also that there will be a degree of antipathy towards us from the other European countries.
Well, those were the views of the public. Let's now find out what our experts have to say.
Britain has suffered greatly as a result of being in the EU, and particularly its relationship with the Commonwealth. The countries that are in the Commonwealth are having far greater economic growth than the countries within the European Union, and some of those countries in the Commonwealth are the emerging economies of the future. Yet Britain turned its back on the Commonwealth when we joined in 1973, and can't have preferential trade relationships with Commonwealth countries. That's all now decided by the European Commission. So really, and international standing has suffered, and the positive relationships we can have with other countries around the world has suffered as a result of being in the EU, which is now beginning to take over a position of having a common foreign policy and perhaps even a common defence policy. And that's undermining Britain's independent voice in the world, because before Britain acts or seeks to have new relationships with other countries around the world, it has to gain the approval of other member states in the EU. Really, it should be a matter for a democratic government in the UK to decide what relationship it has with countries around the world and not be held back by other countries that are in the EU. The position of the European Union would perhaps damage the relationship with America more than being isolated from the EU. The European Union is really taking Britain's voice in the world and taking over Britain's say. It's establishing its own foreign policy, it's establishing its own international civil service, it's establishing embassies around the world. They call it the European External Action Service. That's really taking Britain's voice. And Britain's a major source of inward investment from other countries around the globe, but that's not because we're in the European Union. The main reasons is that the tax regime in Britain is competitive for businesses. The employment laws are relatively flexible, at least to EU standards, and that the education system, well, there's needs for that to be improved, of course, but the standard of life is good, and the skilled workforce are well educated. They're the main reasons why companies come to invest in the EU, invest in Britain, and being a member of the EU isn't really a part of a company's decision making. In fact, it's possibly holding Britain back because of the enormous costs of being in the EU, the tax burden and the regulatory burden. That's what's really damaging Britain.
This decision to veto EU treaty revision does not influence Britain's position in world politics. First of all, it remains to be seen how things will unfold and how the relationship between Britain and the European Union will unfold, because things change. The government might change, for example, and then the relationship might become better, or the government in another country might change, and there will be some room for reconciliation and improvement. Within this context, I believe that the main point is not the decision itself. This was not a wrong decision. Actually, Cameron knew what he wanted, but he failed in diplomacy. By withdrawing his party from the centre-right political group in the European Parliament, he failed to secure the support of possible allies. He failed to communicate his positions with the leaders of the other centre-right political parties, and of course he failed to have alliances in advance. In today's world, no country can survive alone. There are alliances at various levels, and countries cooperate either at international alliances or multinational organizations. So Britain's economic as well as political interests lie in Europe, mainly, and then towards the US and the Commonwealth countries. It is a matter of how the world operates today, and we can see what has happened regarding the economic crisis, the global economic crisis.
At one time, Britain governed almost a quarter of the world, and it has a long history of involvement in international affairs. It remains a permanent member of the UN Security Council. But for how long will Britain be able to maintain that global prominence? And what will be the impact if Britain were to be isolated from its partners in Europe and the United States?
I think we would have been stronger with stronger leaders, really. I mean, I hate to say it, but I think Mrs. Thatcher would have probably done much better.
Yes, and I still think they do.
Do you think that perhaps there are still some delusions of grandeur, that David Cameron harbours a belief that Britain can still stand alone as a great power?
I don't know, probably no more than Mr Sarkozy in France, and look how well they've done, you know, for whatever the basic reasons. Whether they're still afraid that Germany would overtake them, I don't know. He's only probably doing a bit of a Monsieur, no de Gaulle, but or General de Gaulle.
Well, I'm not too sure. I mean, I'm not actually in favour of rearmament, but I think they're not maintaining any armed forces. I mean, because it also has other skills, technical skills, engineering skills. And of course it was Margaret Thatcher, I think, that destroyed the manufacturing base of Britain. We need to get that back.
No, I think Britain's deluding itself. It's got delusions of grandeur left over from the 19th century, and it's completely failing to actually carve out a valid independent role for itself. It's been hanging on America's bootstraps for too long.
What about Britain's relationship to the rest of the world, though? Do you think that there's a danger that perhaps it's becoming a nation in retreat, that it's withdrawing in on itself?
I don't know. I mean, I think if this is the first step towards that, then I would be worried. But you know, as it is, I don't know quite how this will play out, and whether this is going to be a temporary blip, or whether we'll still be, you know, making important decisions with the EU.
It's like people have said about the states, and the countries go through periods when they have more influence and then less influence, and you know, our period of dominance was, you know, perhaps up to the last war or thereabouts. We've been in decline in a sense since then. The States is currently going to be heading for decline. The BRICS are coming up in importance, and that's kind of an inevitable tide of history, I suppose.
What do you think would be the impact if Britain did become isolated from its partners in Europe and even in the United States?
Well, I do think that if that was the long-term picture, that would be a great concern, because, you know, it is very much a globalised world and a globalised economy, and we need to embrace that rather than perhaps closing our borders and shutting their doors and concentrating just on what happens within the UK.
Well, I don't think they would. I think it's a hypothetical question which wait and see.
Well, I don't think we've got any particular ties with the US, so we're simply hanging on their coattails. They use us as and when they see fit and disregard us the rest of the time. With the Commonwealth countries, I don't think there's any. I think those ties are more symbolic than economic and so on, and it would be silly to cut them because they are bonds of friendship and so on.
What would be the impact, do you think, if Britain did become isolated from Europe?
We can't be isolated because we're already intrinsically part of a lot of our trade. Even if we did decide to sideline the EEC, we would still be totally involved with them in terms of trade anyway. They can't ignore us.
We can't sever ties. I mean, globalisation is irreversible, fortunately or unfortunately. I mean, people have their own views on that.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Thank you for joining us. If you've got anything to say yourself, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. Meanwhile, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.